I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Tim Goeglein is our guest on today's BreakPoint podcast. He's Vice President for External and Governmental Relations at Focus on the Family, but his job, which he's had for over a decade now, is just the latest in what's been a 30-year career in Washington, including 8 years working in the West Wing for President George W. Bush. Tim Goeglein says his time in Washington hasn't made him cynical. In fact, as you'll hear, it's made him hopeful. But it's a hope underpinned by the hope of the gospel and the belief that Christians can and will engage the current culture and not flee from it. These are ideas he explains in his new book, American Restoration: How Faith, Family, and Personal Sacrifice Can Heal Our Nation. It's a book he co-wrote with Craig Osten. The Colson Center's Warren Cole Smith had this conversation with Tim Goeglein at Tim's office on Capitol Hill within sight of the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol.
Tim, welcome to the program. It's always great to see you with your bow tie and your smile. You are just one of the most upbeat and positive persons I know. And I read in your book, in this new book, that a lot of that comes from your family, that you just had a good, godly upbringing and gave you, I guess, this outlook on life. Is that fair?
It is fair, and thank you so much for this time, Warren. I love seeing you as well. I love our friendship.
Yep.
I would have made a terrible novelist because I had a happy home. My parents met when they were in their teens. In fact, I don't put this in the book, but it's a fact. They met in a study hall, I think in 8th or 9th grade. 62 years of marriage. My mother went to heaven last year. My father is still living. He's my best friend. And I had a very happy upbringing. We were a serious family of faith, a family of Christians. My parents very serious about their faith, and it was a beautiful way to grow up. My grandparents lived in the same city. My extended family lived in the same city. It was a really wonderful way to spend my boyhood.
And now Indiana, right?
Indiana, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Yeah, and so and you got your start really in politics with Dan Coates, right?
I did. When I was in 6th grade, I decided that I wanted to be involved in a campaign of some kind. I'd been influenced actually by a neighbor friend in this regard. And the first thing I ever did was I went door to door dropping off door knockers for Dan Quayle, who was, it turned out, was successful in his run for the House of Representatives. And I was involved every 2 years thereafter for somebody, usually Dan Quayle or Dan Coates. In the summer of 1985, I was an intern in the United States Senate for Dan Quayle. He was then the youngest senator in the Senate, and it was a wonderful internship. I was then at Indiana University, and the following summer, the summer of 1986, I came back to Washington. I was an intern in the House of Representatives. So the Senate one summer, the House the next, and at NBC News for Roger Mudd on the weekends here in Washington. So I really had a wonderful, by God's grace, a really wonderful 2 summers.
Yeah, I don't think I understood that or remembered that, the Roger Mudd part, which of course prepared you well for ultimately you became a press secretary to Dan Coates. Is that right?
I did, and much of my young training was the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism at Indiana University. Of course, Ernie Pyle, I'm terribly biased, the greatest journalist of World War II, killed with the troops in the South Pacific from Little Dana, Indiana. But I must tell you, Warren, I had a remarkable summer in the summer of 1986 at NBC News. That was for many of those great correspondents who had covered the Korean conflict, who had covered Vietnam, who had covered the civil rights movement. Many of them were closing their careers. Irv Levine, Roger Mudd, Doug Kiker, John Palmer. And, it was a remarkable thing to really learn from these rather extraordinary journalists.
Well, that is extraordinary because every name that you mentioned is a name that I know, and it's legendary in some ways. Maybe not quite like the Murrow boys of CBS, but storied journalists in their own right.
I love to tell this story. I still see Roger Mudd once a year. He lives in Northern Virginia. We have lunch together. What an incredible career. He's one of the last people, I think, in Washington, D.C. who actually knew Ed Murrow, which is pretty extraordinary. And it's also extraordinary in light of the anniversaries that we are all commemorating of the space launch, all the great speeches in the civil rights movement that Roger covered, the I Have a Dream speech for CBS News at the time. So, it was a storied time, and this combination of politics, public policy, and the press got into my DNA.
Well, it obviously did, and we're going to telescope a lot of your history, Tim, because I really want to get straight into this book. But I wanted to give at least that overview, or have you give that overview, because it really does set the stage for this book, this new book that you've written, American Restoration. And I'm leaving out, of course, the 8 years that you spent in the George W. Bush administration, which you also wrote a book about. The Man in the Mirror, I believe is the
That's
name
correct,
of that book.
yes.
And really fascinating read there. All that context to ask these two questions. Why this book and why now? Because, obviously you're a writer, you're a journalist, you've been a journalist, you're a communicator, you've been that your whole life. And yet this is just your second book. It's 8 years after your first book. Again, why this book? Why now?
Well, I'm one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family here in Washington, where I've lived and worked for 30 years. Mm-hmm. And I travel a lot for Focus on the Family, whether I go to Maine, South Carolina, Alaska, California, Texas, or any place in the middle. When I speak or make remarks and we get to the Q&A or conversation and dialogue, with absolute predictability, somebody will stand up, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, and will say the following: I've never been more concerned about my country than I am now. Warren, if they have children or grandchildren, they will say, I've never been more concerned about the country that I'm leaving them. And the third thing they say, most importantly, is the following: I don't know what to do. And in my time of reading, travel, really thinking about, these questions, I've been heavily influenced by the sociologist Charles Murray, whose must-read book, Coming Apart, tells the story of the chaos and social dysfunction that defines much of contemporary America. Alienated Americans by my friend Tim Carney, another must-read book, and Generation Unbound by a very thoughtful, progressive historian, Belle Sawhill. I spent time, as you said, for 8 years in the White House with George W. Bush. She worked for Bill Clinton. And that book, Generation Unbound, is powerful. And so I thought to myself, all these great books have something in common. They all distill why the chaos. They all distill why the social dysfunction. They talk at length about what's happening in urban, rural, exurban America, but they don't really say, well, what's the way forward? And I said to my co-author, Craig Osten, let's do a book on how to restore, how to regenerate, how to renew America. And so we called it simply American Restoration: How Faith, Family, and Personal Sacrifice Can Heal Our Nation. We are categorical hopefulists because we are Christians. I'm not a confetti to the wind optimist. I don't think there's ever going to be the conservative equivalent of the Great Society. A Washington-directed, Silicon Valley-directed, Hollywood-directed restoration of America. The way it's going to happen is organically from the bottom up. In our homes, in our marriages, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our churches. And the Judeo-Christian principle works. It's a great way forward for America. So we believe very strongly that the best days for our country are genuinely ahead of us, not behind us.
Well, you're speaking my language, Tim. As you know, John Stonestreet and I wrote a book called Restoring All Things, which could fit hand in glove. In fact, even some of the chapter titles in your book could have been chapter titles in our book. But one of the things that I really love about your book is what you just said, that you kind of in some ways point us back to first principles, that the Judeo-Christian worldview, the Christian ethic, if you will, or found in Scripture, really does work. And one of the ideas that shows up over and over and over again, but especially towards the beginning of your book, and I want you to talk a little about this, is the idea of the Imago Dei, that we are all made in the image of God. And that is a uniquely biblical idea. And in some ways, it's a foundational idea for this American restoration that you're talking about, because it deals with the life issue, it deals with the marriage issue, it deals with a lot of the racial and other kinds of social upheaval that's going on in the country. Is that a fair assessment? And would you say more?
It's a very fair assessment. 2 snapshots, if I may. The second time that I ever met Chuck Colson, and I know who I'm speaking with today,
right.
Love the Colson Center, love everything you do, period, A to Z. The second time I met Chuck Colson, he said to me, just like we're having a conversation here, he said, just remember, Tim, that the body of our ethics, the foundation of it, begins in this concept that everybody counts. Everybody matters. Why, Chuck? Because we are all made in the image of God. Wow, what an incredible way to think about ethics. Second snapshot. Several years later, I'm sitting in the office at the American Enterprise Institute with my great friend Arthur Brooks, who had just been made the president of AEI, recently retired, resigned, all under good circumstances.
I know Arthur.
Going to Harvard, yes.
He's a hero of mine, too.
And he will do an extraordinary job
Yep.
at Harvard. And he said to me, just again, like we're talking today, he said to me, Tim, we ought to ask ourselves more often, what kind of a country do we want 50 years from now? And I'm just pausing for a minute because when Arthur said that, immediately I thought of Chuck Colson. I thought that any answer to that extraordinary question, by the way, that's a question that we deal with at length, as you know, in American Restoration, because we believe in our country, we believe in our culture, in our civilization. But the whole thing that powers it is this combination of the Imago Dei. Everybody has dignity. Everybody has worth. Everybody is absolutely, totally equal in the eyes of God. We combine this Judeo-Christian foundational principle, an immutable principle, with the idea, this side of eternity, of what kind of a country do we want the United States of America to be. And so in 15 chapters, rooted in what we believe are 15 great ideas, every one of those chapters beginning with the word restoring, we talk about the acts of renewal, the acts of regeneration. Restoring family and marriage, restoring biblical values, restoring the Constitution. And the one chapter, and by now, I say with humility, I've done several interviews on the book. The only chapter, Warren, that I've been asked about in every single interview is the chapter Restoring the Idea of a Gentleman.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you about that later, but not right now.
I think it's foundational.
I do too. It's one of the very few chapters that I wanted to single out and talk to you about. But before we get there, there's another idea. So the image of the Imago Dei is vital. It really permeates the entire book. There's another idea that I wanted you to say a little bit more about. You've already brought it up, but that is that the best days are ahead. A lot of Christians, and to me, it kind of baffles me. I mean, I understand why others might say this, but for Christians who should have read the last chapter of the book and know that God wins, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I always struggle with this idea that Christians are such doomsdayers when they look at our culture. And they don't realize, among other things, that in Acts 17, for example, Paul says on Mars Hill, God has appointed the times for us to live, and he has circumscribed the boundaries of our dwelling place. In other words, if we say to ourselves, it was so much better 25 years ago, or I wish I had lived 50 years ago, I mean, that is really an affront to the sovereignty of God in many, many ways. God put us here right now to be about this work of restoration that you're describing.
One of the most extraordinary books that I've been honored to read in the last 20 years was written by the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. And it's a wonderful book called Team of Rivals. And in fact, for anybody who loves politics, public policy, history, the 19th century, above all, the great Abraham Lincoln, it is a peerless book. And what she does so seamlessly is she shows us what was happening in our country, right, between 1855 and the election of the great Lincoln in 1860. Warren, may I just say, to your exact example, it would have been really tempting in all those years leading up to the election of Abraham Lincoln for people of goodwill, for people who think about things, for people who were very involved in American public life at any level to say, it's over. We've had a nullification crisis, which nearly broke up the country. We are in the midst of a cold civil war that absolutely everybody who thinks about these things is certain that by the first day of Lincoln's inaugural, that it's going to be one part of the country at the throat of the other part of the country. And it is so routine today in America for people of goodwill on both sides of the aisle to despair and to be discouraged. But back to your perfect example of St. Paul, discouragement and despair, said St. Augustine, is a sin. Why? Because it negates the hope of Jesus Christ in the life of a great nation and in the life of an individual. renewal, redemption, the way forward is possible. And so we have to have a national dialogue right now, not 10 years from now, but right now. And that dialogue between people of goodwill who hold competing worldviews, back to Chuck Colson, right? We have to be able to find a way, and that's why we did a chapter restoring our civil discourse. We have to find a way to say, what kind of a country do we want, and what are going to be the components in the way forward? And American Restoration is designed to contribute to that conversation and national dialogue.
Okay, so Tim, I wouldn't let you talk about the chapter on gentlemanliness in the first segment, but let's get to it now. You do have a chapter, Restoring the Concept of the Gentleman, and it was one of the chapters that once I read, I was like, of course. But before I read it, or whenever I just read the chapter title, I was like, that's an interesting choice. So say more about that.
I'd love to. I wrote an article for Citizen magazine for Focus on the Family several years ago called The Idea of a Gentleman. And it was not about Fred Astaire. It's not about top hats and dancing in, tails and white ties. It's about this unique concept of a man of integrity, a man of character, a man who values masculinity, a person who knows the difference between yes and no, a person who treats women really well, beginning with wife, daughters, mother, etc. A person who embodies great personal honor and has a moral code that is immutable. And I used Abraham Lincoln, I used George Washington, and others as examples. Warren, nothing that I have ever written got that much attention. And overwhelmingly and counterintuitively, from young mothers from all around the country who sent me emails, letters, etc., saying, I have a young son. I have a young boy. I know that he's going to grow up to be a man. But famously, to me, a woman said in a letter, but not every man is going to become a gentleman. I'm really concerned about the culture we're in, and I want to have a son who will become a gentleman, a man of integrity and character. This is long before the Me Too movement, but I think it was a presage in our coarsened culture about the importance to the vitality of our nation that we have a next generation in the worlds of moral ecology, that we have a next generation of gentlemen.
Well, since you brought up the Me Too movement, I mean, Tim, in some ways, talking about what it means to be a gentleman sounds hopelessly old-fashioned. And yet, when we think about it in the context of the Me Too movement, couldn't be more relevant to what's going on today. And one of the things that one of the things you just said was that a gentleman, among other things, is knows how to treat women, and knows the difference between yes and no. And we hear a lot of talk today about consent and the consent culture. But one of the things that you say in the book is that yes, consent is important in relationships between men and women, but it's not enough. It's not enough. Can you say more about that?
I'd love to. The thing that constitutes a gentleman, the thing that constitutes a lady, is a moral code that is unbreakable. And it begins with a comfortability in the distinction between right and wrong. And one of the things that I think is so important to say in light of our conversation today is that moral relativism is a kind of corrosive thing that has seeped into our politics, making it poisonous. It seeped into our culture and made it toxic. So this idea of the gentleman, the idea of a lady, in my view, Warren, those are evergreen topics. It's not just, a person who's well-dressed or knows how to comport himself or herself. That's important. But it goes to this fundamental question of the embodiment of the best of the Judeo-Christian tradition. No one is perfect. We are all sinners, right? Saved by grace. But that does not mean that we do not have a benchmark. And the benchmark of a gentleman is very important when we discuss the way forward for America.
Well, I'm going to read some of your own words back to you, Tim. Burke believed a true gentleman, Edmund Burke, believed a true gentleman made the best citizen because he made countless excellent contributions to his family, church, community, and country. through self-sacrifice, personal discipline, and internal strength while exhibiting a tender heart. Okay, that's one passage. Hold that. Here's another passage. Instead of asking, how much money will I make? How fast can I climb the corporate ladder? How can I find self-fulfillment? The questions young men should be asking themselves of the spiritual and moral ilk. How do I become a good man? How can I make a lifelong contribution to my family and society? What is my ultimate purpose in life? These are the questions that you've pondered and tried to instill in your sons. This is what your book says. Say a little more about that.
I'd be happy to. Our sons are 23 and 21. Tim and Paul, they're the glory of our life. Jenny's and my sons. It's our favorite topic. And when our sons were preparing to choose a college, maybe you had this in your family as well, they were overwhelmed with the following question: what do you want to do? In fact, I kept saying to our children, I wish we would have a $10 bill for the predictable sense. People of goodwill, by the way, who's saying, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? What do you want to do? That's a very American question.
Yeah.
God bless America. The better question is, who do you want to be? And that's what we're talking about here. And this is an important thing. It's not an existential. It's not a philosophical. It's not a sort of a weighty, huge topic. This is the question of what constitutes the good life. And what am I honor bound to do? May I tell you, we are preoccupied. We are in a sea of conversation about rights. Very important. I think we ought to equalize that with an important conversation about duties. Because duties, it seems to me, rightly understood, rightly practiced, that constitutes the answer to the life well lived.
Tim, I'm going to skip around a little bit in your book because I think that another chapter kind of goes with this gentleman chapter, and that is the chapter on civility. You've got a whole chapter on restoring civility, and one of the things that you talk about as being the enemy of civility is contempt. And I wonder, even though y'all don't talk about, you have a whole separate chapter on life, restoring a culture of life, but I do wonder if the abortion controversy in this country hasn't contributed to that atmosphere of contempt. In other words, if you and I disagree about whether we should grant China most favored nation status or whether we should have what kind of trade agreement we should have with the European Union, I might disagree with you, but I don't think you're evil over that disagreement. But abortion, it seems to me, has really polluted the national conversation, in some ways turned political combatants into true contemptuous enemies with each other. First of all, does that make sense to you? I mean, do you think
Absolutely.
Abortion has been a particularly polluting aspect of our culture? And how do we get away from that contempt and back towards a culture of civility?
I'm so grateful you asked this question, and more than you know, Warren, for this reason. I mentioned earlier that I have spent a good part of my life, 10 years, working in the United States Senate for Dan Coates, right? 8 years, or nearly 8 years, for George W. Bush at the White House, and I'm now in my 11th year at Focus on the Family, all of them living and working inside the Beltway. If there is one measurement that I have seen in the category of drastic change across those 3 decades, it is absolutely, with no equal, this chapter in American Restoration and this narrative that we're talking about. The lack of basic civility. It's missing grace. It's missing magnanimity. It's missing diplomacy. It really is okay to disagree gracefully, magnanimously, with mercy toward the person with whom you disagree. You can even do so unapologetically, and you can do so diplomatically. But we have got to find a way. In fact, I would say it is morally incumbent upon us to find a way forward for our national dialogue to disagree agreeably on the biggest topics that there are.
I get that, and I let's just stipulate for the record, Tim, that I agree with you. But it is very hard for me to trust the moral compass of someone who thinks killing 1 million babies a year is okay.
May I tell you, routinely in my own life, and I mean iron sharpening iron, I've had these debates. I've witnessed these debates, sat in the Senate gallery, sat at the White House, here at Focus on the Family, etc. I couldn't agree with you more. No, I mentioned earlier the nullification crisis. I mentioned earlier the fact that a civil war that resulted in 750,000 deaths in a country, overwhelmingly smaller than the one that we live in.
Yeah.
I mean, cousins were really shooting and killing each other in peach orchards in our own country, right? Over this question, this basic question about whether a person who is African American is a person. Now, that to me is on another scale, the kind of massive debate we are having now on the question of human life. Warren, here's the great news. And I mean, this is the really great news. If you are pro-life, which I have been my entire life and been very involved in this debate, elementally, there's been no public policy debate that I've invested more of personal hours in than this issue of human life. Here's the great news. We are winning. I believe that. I mean, and I think you can measure whether you are winning or losing on the question of life. I'm going to share this if I may. I sat in an office with Dan Coates, who was a brand new member of the Senate. And I had somebody who's very well known to people listening to us today who essentially said to him, and I'm paraphrasing, this debate is over. Abortion is a loser. Don't ever talk about this issue again. Because if you talk about it again, you may not be reelected to the United States Senate. I mean, this is where that debate was in real time in the late 1980s. And Dan Coates, to his great credit, said the following: I'm pro-life and I am going to talk about it. And of course, he was a leader in those years in the Senate for this issue. The pro-life cause is absolutely, by any objective measure, one of the great civil rights issues of our time, and largely successful because we have, those of us who are pro-life, right, in a pro-abortion atmosphere, we have found a way to execute, right, our view in the public life, and to do so successfully.
Well, I get that, and I agree with you. It's clear from looking at public opinion surveys that we are slowly becoming a more of a pro-life nation. So what do we do with those that seem to be intractable on this issue? Do we just, as Jesus said, shake the dust off of our sandals and move on to the next person, look for people of goodwill and peace that might disagree with us but are influenceable, or is there a third way?
I think there are several things that we do, but for purposes of time, there's two big ideas that come to mind. One is nobody is persuaded with a knuckle in the chest. I think we are really long past that kind of success on this particular topic. One of the things that the pro-life movement has done to its great glory is we have found a way through story, through narrative, through personal engagement to share the absolute beauty and truth of every baby. And we have done so successfully in a way that absolutely major issues in the pro-abortion movement have just in the last few years say, I can no longer in good conscience defend that position. When you study and find out what persuaded them, you find overwhelmingly it's what we're doing today. It's a personal story. It's a personal relationship. It's engagement at that level. The second thing that is also happening is that in the public square, we are watching the refashioning of the judicial legacy in the United States. In the Trump presidency, we have had more appellate, more district, and more Supreme Court justices successfully nominated and confirmed in a shorter period of time than ever in American history. That is not nothing. Of course, we can never say for certain all of these judges will do the right thing on the issue of life. But public policy matters, and in my view, it is categorically going in the right direction.
Shane Morris here again. We're taking a quick break from today's conversation with Tim Goeglein to remind you that today's podcast and all of our other work here at the Colson Center wouldn't be possible without the generous support of listeners like you. If you're a regular supporter of the Colson Center, I want to take this moment to thank you. If you're not, but would like to learn more about how you can partner with us in our work, go to breakpoint.org and click on the Donate tab at the top of the page. Now let's get back to Warren Cole Smith's conversation with Focus on the Family's Tim Goeglein.
Tim, I'd like to hit you with just a lightning round of questions in closing, if we could. I know you worked for Dan Coats for a long time. Dan Coats was in the Trump administration. He was kind of unceremoniously canned from the Trump administration. Have you had a chance to talk to him lately?
Dan Coats is a great friend next to my father. He is the man who I love and honor most in the world. I have been in touch with him, and I'm happy to say, and I hope this is as categorical as I can be, if Dan Coats is not a good man, Warren, there are no good men.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Does that mean he's doing okay? Does that mean, is he frustrated or angry or?
This is a man who spent 24 years in public life, in the House, in the Senate. He was also our ambassador to Germany, and he is, as you say, been our director of national intelligence. In other words, our top spy.
Yeah.
He's 76 years old. He's in love with his wife, Marcia, children, grandchildren. He's extremely comfortable with where he's in life. And I'll tell you, even at the age of 76, I predict that there is something very good to come for him still in public life.
Well, that's really interesting. So what you're telling me is that Dan Coats will be fine, but we miss him in public life. Let me just speak for myself. I miss him in public life.
Me too.
I think he was treated badly by this administration.
May I tell you, Dan Coats is an uncommonly decent man. He is a person who is humble. And the most extraordinary thing about Dan Coats, the most extraordinary thing, I saw it when I was an intern in the House. I saw it when I worked for 10 years in the U.S. Senate. We were colleagues in the Bush administration when he was ambassador to Germany and all the years since. The number one thing, he is the same in private as he is in public. In Washington, that is so incredibly rare. And he loves to do the following. Tell me what you think. Why do you think that? And then he does something remarkable. He listens. He's just really a person who has gone from being a politician to a statesman. And that kind of invisible line very rarely happens. But he has entered, in my view, he's entered into that pantheon.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a big fan of his and share your high regard, and also makes, I think, his departure from government all the more tragic for our country. But Tim, you wouldn't be you if you weren't as circumspect and as gracious as you just were in your answers to my questions. So I appreciate that very much. The second person I got to ask you about, and that is your old boss, George W. Bush. Are you ever in touch with him? How's he doing?
I am in touch with George W. Bush. I see President Bush at least once a year and sometimes twice. I'm very happy to say we're a very close White House staff, and I will be seeing President Bush here in Washington at least once and maybe twice in September when the Bush-Cheney administration from the White House is going to have a wonderful get-together. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Well, now that you've had maybe 10 years to reflect on that experience, I guess he went out of office in January of 2009, and now we're into 2019, so it has been a little over 10 years. Refute this narrative or respond to this narrative. I think a lot of people look at George W. Bush's presidency as being maybe one that didn't live up to its full potential. Maybe not quite as feckless or passionless as the Carter administration, but one that was derailed by 9/11 and was never able to really get back on track. Agree or disagree?
May I say, I think that in the popular imagination, that in fact, could be the case. But I have a friend who is a very important historian of Ulysses Grant. And he famously said to me, Tim, it would have been unfashionable at the time because of all the views of Ulysses Grant for years and years. But the more that we learn about that administration, the more we say, oh, my heavens. And my friend, the historian, said, buy stock in Bush, because with the advent of time, we will look again at the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We will look again at the Great Recession. We will look again at Katrina. It's important to do that. And, every administration, every single one has the potential of having, a difficult period of time.
Yeah. Well, I think a case in point would be the war in Afghanistan, right? A lot of people were calling it Bush's war whenever he left the White House. And yet here we are 8, 10, 12 years later. And every president that has promised to get us out of Afghanistan has not been able to do so. And yet we also, even though I'm not trying to in any way diminish the sacrifice of our servicemen who have been killed or wounded and their families and the sacrifice that they have made, the management of that war under Bush has been at least as good, if not better, than the management of that war under his successors.
I totally agree, and I can speak with humility, I pray, but from firsthand account. And this really matters. George W. Bush is a person of categorical integrity, categorical high character, and a person who I believe was a truly, genuinely, not only fine person, but a very important and successful president. And I think that it's going to be interesting over the course of the next 25 and 30 years to look at how people of goodwill, when they begin to look at all the details, to actually say, I think we ought to give this another assessment or reassessment, as we've done with Grant and with several other presidents. I think that will happen for the George W. Bush administration. And I think we'll come to see that 43 was actually a very gifted, excellent president.
Final question, Tim. Before we turn the recorder on, you were telling me that this may have been, the last couple of years may have been the busiest years of your life. Why?
You know, my role is to be focused on the family's eyes and ears in Washington, to be our ambassador on the issues of family, marriage, parenting, pro-life, religious liberty, etc. We are very interested and part of the coalition on Supreme Court justices, appellate judges, district judges, on the whole issue of life, religious liberty, marriage, in all the executive cabinet agencies, in the House, in the Senate, etc. This has been an extraordinary 24 months. May I say, whether somebody listening today is a detractor of Donald Trump and Mike Pence, or if somebody's listening today and they are champions of Donald Trump and Mike Pence, nobody of goodwill can conclude that this has not been already a presidency of consequence. And consequence matters. And I think we are, heading into a presidential election year on policy, on personnel, that will say whether this period of American history and the way that we were led in it was the right thing for this part of 21st century America or was not. My own sense is that when it comes, for instance, to things like the pro-life movement, the issues of religious liberty and conscience rights, who is on the Supreme Court, who are on the federal courts. I think that conservatives and men and women of faith like us, I think we have a lot to be pleased with. And I feel that will be confirmed by historians 50 years from now.
Yeah, but you don't feel, though, that this president's temperament and sometimes the way he engages public conversation is alienating folks and maybe turning them off to the conservative brand? In other words, is it possible that we might have 3 or 4 years of success and that the cost of that will be 10, 20, 30 years of an American populace that will say, I don't want to have anything to do with conservatism ever again?
I believe very strongly that we are having this massive debate between whether President Trump will be the next president of the United States and whether between 25 and 27, Democrats who will take his place, will be the person. That is on one track. That is a massive debate. But I think there is a separate, very important debate going on among American conservatives who are asking, does the paradigm that we think of as conservatism, right, which is this combination of libertarian economics, hawkish foreign policy, and moral and social conservatism, does that paradigm still serve for this part of the 21st century in American conservatism? That to me is a rollicking, important debate. And I'm really uncertain on the outcome of both. But I think I am certain that it's important, more important than ever, that we, all of us at the Colson Center, at Focus on the Family, at the Heritage Foundation, all of our friends and allies, that we engage as never before. And the thing that American Restoration says is it's awfully tempting to say, I'm done. I'm discouraged, I'm despairing, I'm disengaging, I'm standing down. And I think that the opposite is the case. We have to engage more than ever before, and we have to appeal to and reach out to the rising generation of young Christian men and women to say, here's why it matters.
Tim, thanks so much for your time. I could do this all day long. I appreciate your time today. It's been really a lot of fun.
Warren, thank you so much. I mean, a real pleasure.
That was Focus on the Family's Tim Goeglein discussing his new book, American Restoration, with Warren Cole-Smith, Vice President of the Colson Center. Before we go, I'd like to remind you that the Colson Center is offering a book this month that explores in more depth the issues Warren and Tim discussed today. Free to Believe is a powerful new book by Luke Goodrich, an attorney for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, where he's represented Hobby Lobby and Little Sisters of the Poor before the U.S. Supreme Court. You can get this new book by Luke Goodrich by going to breakpoint.org/book and making a donation of any size to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Again, that's breakpoint.org/book. Thanks for listening to today's BreakPoint podcast. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.